After spending more than 26 years on death row, Geoffrey Todd West was executed by nitrogen hypoxia in Alabama. But this story doesn't begin in the execution chamber. It begins on a spring night in 1997 at a quiet gas station on Nakalula Parkway, where a robbery ended in a fatal shooting. What followed was a capital murder conviction, decades on death row, and at the very end, his last meal, his final words, and an unexpected offer of forgiveness from the victim's son. It was the late hours of March 27, 1997, sliding into the early morning of the 28th in Gadsden, Alabama. Geoffrey was just 21 years old, but his life was already fractured beyond repair. He was deep into drugs, and he was out on parole after an earlier robbery conviction had sent him to prison. That night, he drove through the dark streets with his girlfriend, Amy Pierce, at his side. Their destination wasn't random. They were on their way to Harold Chevron, a small gas station off Nakalula Parkway. Geoffrey had worked there once. He knew the layout, the shifts, and the quiet moments when no one was watching. But this wasn't just a trip down memory lane. Geoffrey had a plan, and people in his circle had already heard the warning signs. He wanted to rob the Chevron, but not like last time. The last time, he had been caught, identified by a clerk who lived to tell the story. And that humiliation stuck with him. So this time, he promised things would end differently. He told people what he planned to do. He wouldn't leave no witnesses. His words were clear: kill the person up there. Inside the store, 33-year-old Margaret Berry was working the night shift. Geoffrey walked in with a .45 caliber handgun, and what happened next was fast. He pointed the weapon at her, forced her to the ground behind the counter, and took $250 from a cookie can where the store kept some of its money. Then he pressed the gun to the back of her head and pulled the trigger. He fired just one shot, and Maggie died immediately. Geoffrey then calmly walked back to the car where Amy was still waiting, got in, and drove away. And just like that, a life ended for just $250. But the police weren't far behind. The investigation moved quickly, and within hours, detectives were already chasing leads. And it didn't take long for a name to surface. Donna Mitchell, another Chevron employee, told investigators she had seen Geoffrey in the store a day or two before the shooting, and he hadn't been alone. With him was Joseph Scott Huey, a man detectives already knew well. Scott had a long history with law enforcement. He had been in and out of trouble for years, and sometimes even served as an informant, which made him easy to track down. Investigators went straight to him, and the connection between Scott and Geoffrey gave detectives their first solid lead. From that point on, the case moved quickly. Prosecutors would later tell the jury that the crime had been solved within 24 hours, and they weren't exaggerating. Donna's statement, the fact that Geoffrey had worked at the Chevron in the past, and his link to Scott gave detectives everything they needed. Geoffrey was arrested just days after the March 1997 murder, but it took much longer before his case ever reached a jury. 2 years later, in June of 1999, the trial finally began. By then, the state had built a mountain of evidence. There were the statements Geoffrey had made before the crime, telling people he wanted to rob the Chevron and leave no witnesses. There were the letters he wrote to his girlfriend, Amy Pierce. She admitted on the stand that she had blacked out lines because they made Geoffrey look guilty. And when a state document examiner used special lighting and chemical methods to uncover the original text, those hidden words pointed directly to Geoffrey's role in the murder. It all painted the same picture. Geoffrey planned the robbery, carried it out, and silenced Maggie to keep himself from being identified. On June 1, 1999, the jury convicted Geoffrey of capital murder during the course of a robbery, and that same afternoon, the penalty phase began. The jury had to decide life in prison without parole or death. Geoffrey's lawyer stood up and began to argue for mercy, laying out reasons why his client should be spared. But Geoffrey wasn't interested. In front of the court, he yanked his attorney back into his seat and told him not to say another word. He told him that he was innocent and said that he didn't want a life behind bars. If he couldn't walk out as a free man, he would rather die. And the jury took him at his word. By a vote of 10-2, they recommended death. A month later, on July 7th, the judge reviewed the case and agreed. Geoffrey was sentenced to die. And even though Geoffrey had asked for it, he likely didn't expect it would take nearly 3 decades before the sentence would finally be carried out. In those years, he filed appeal after appeal, hoping for a way out. But every attempt failed. The conviction and the death sentence stood. The court cited 2 aggravating factors. He had committed the murder while already under a sentence of imprisonment, and he killed Maggie while committing a robbery. His youth and limited criminal record were offered as mitigating factors, but in the end, they didn't matter. The brutality of the crime outweighed everything else. But Geoffrey wasn't the only one under scrutiny. Amy hadn't pulled the trigger, but she was still part of what happened that night and what followed. She wasn't just his girlfriend. She was there when Maggie died, and prosecutors said she played a role in what happened afterward. When investigators started pulling the case together, Amy's actions stood out. She had received letters from Geoffrey in jail, but instead of giving them to law enforcement, she tried to protect him. She blacked out the most damaging lines before handing them over. And because she was behind the wheel of the getaway car, prosecutors charged her with the same crimes as Geoffrey. She didn't escape accountability. They argued that she had helped hide the truth, covered for him, and tried to steer the investigation off track. Amy eventually pleaded guilty and agreed to testify. She was sentenced to 35 years in prison. But there's no record of her being held in any Alabama prison at this moment, 28 years after her arrest, which means she was released early. However, after 26 years on death row, Geoffrey's time was running out. A date had finally been set, September 25, 2025. The legal battles were over and the state was preparing to carry out the sentence. But not everyone was ready for it. Maggie's son had been just 11 years old when his mother was murdered. He was old enough to understand what had happened, but far too young to process the weight of it. For nearly 3 decades, he lived in the shadow of that night. He has watched as every headline, every court date, and every appeal has focused on Geoffrey. And through it all, the system kept making decisions in his name without ever asking what he wanted. Now, with Geoffrey's execution date set for September 25th, Maggie's son finally stepped forward with something no one expected. He didn't want Alabama to execute the man who killed his mother because it wouldn't bring her back. Instead, he wanted something else. A conversation, a face-to-face meeting with Geoffrey, to ask the questions that haunted him, and most of all, to say something no one expected. He forgave him. That decision came from faith. He believed in the words of Christ, that forgiveness opens the door to salvation. In his eyes, life in prison without parole was punishment enough. Death, he said, was the state trying to play God. And he had a message for him. "I love you," he wanted to tell Geoffrey. "God loves you. My mother would love you because we forgive you." Through his lawyers, Geoffrey agreed to the meeting. Even with time running out, he said yes. He didn't want to deny what happened. He admitted that he killed Maggie. At 50 years old, he said he still struggled to understand the choice he made at 21. From his cell, Geoffrey admitted the weight of it never left him. "There's not a day that goes by that I don't regret it. I wish I could take it back," he said. What he wanted most, he explained, was the chance to look Maggie's family in the eye and apologize. "I'm so very sorry for the hurt I've caused you all. I'm sorry for what I took from you. I hope and I pray that you can forgive me." Maggie's son believed his mother would have wanted that. He believed she had already forgiven Geoffrey, too. "I don't want this man to die," he said. "Vengeance isn't for the state, it's for the Lord." He begged Governor Kay Ivey to grant a reprieve. He asked for just a little more time. Time to sit down with the man who murdered his mother. He even delivered a petition to Governor Kay Ivey's office asking her to halt the execution. But the governor's reply was firm. She said she respected his belief, yet the law was clear. Alabama reserved death for what it called the most egregious forms of murder, and she had to respect that law. The clock kept ticking, and the state went forward with the execution. In the final weeks, Geoffrey and Maggie's son exchanged letters. Both men asked for a meeting before the execution, but the state refused, citing security concerns. This means that the wishes for his mother would not be granted. The two would not meet face to face, and Geoffrey was executed. On the evening of September 25, 2025, it was time. Geoffrey spent his final hours with 8 visitors, and for his final meal, he chose chicken quesadillas. His execution would be carried out using nitrogen gas, a method Alabama had only recently begun using. The process involved strapping a tight gas mask to his face and pumping in pure nitrogen, cutting off the oxygen he needed to survive. At 5:56 p.m., officers strapped him to the gurney. His face was calm, and he turned slightly to give his attorney a final thumbs up from behind the mask. When the warden asked if he had any final words, Geoffrey simply replied, "No, sir." But through his attorney, he left a message. He said he was deeply moved by the forgiveness offered by Maggie's son. He also shared he had converted to Catholicism earlier that year and had been baptized. "I am at peace," he wrote, "because I know where I'm going, and I look forward to seeing Mrs. Berry when I get there." Then the gas began to flow. For the first 2 minutes, he was conscious and seemed to struggle. His eyes stayed open. His chest heaved and his mouth twitched. His head rocked to the side and his left hand curled into a fist. He appeared to foam slightly at the mouth. Around 6:01, his breathing began to slow, shallow, broken by long gaps. And by 6:07, he stopped moving. He was pronounced dead at 6:22 p.m. Geoffrey Todd West was 50 years old. At that very same moment, in a different part of the country, another execution took place. If you haven't seen that video yet, make sure to watch it next.